Well, welcome. Going to be looking at in this video we're going to be looking at Aboriginal beliefs and analysis, and essentially how you can analyze Indigenous texts or texts by Indigenous authors that incorporate themes to do with Aboriginal identity. Okay, so many of the texts you encounter not only contain these themes, but they are related to Aboriginal beliefs, Aboriginal communities, and Aboriginal history. Okay, so first of all, you probably do need to do a little bit of research about the context of these communities and learn a bit about beliefs and value systems of Indigenous communities in Australia. The other thing you need to do is you need to look at connections with events such as the stolen generations as well, as many of the texts that you will be looking at will have those sorts of connections. The other thing to remember is that Indigenous texts are written by an author who has their own perspective and their own way of looking at things, just the same way as any other text does. So when you're looking at these texts, it's important not to just see them as representative of the Aboriginal community, but see them as a representative of someone who identifies as being Aboriginal. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. Okay, to start with, Aboriginal stories and texts have unique themes and, as I said, do not ubiquitously represent the entire population. It's not representing them as a whole, as in common. And the reason before that, as I said before, is that an author or a composer of a text, whether they're Indigenous or not, will have their own perspective and their own way of looking at the world. And so when you look at the things that a text has to say, you're really looking at their personal point of view and their opinion. And the biggest danger that I often find when I'm marking students who have written about an Indigenous text is they'll say that all Aboriginal people do this and all Aboriginal people do that, which is not the case, because if you read a text from for instance, a British author, it's like saying all British people do this and all British people do that. They don't. It's just representing communities as they are. So it's representing their voice and their own point of view. As I said, they represent an individual's personal and cultural perspective, as all other texts do. So when you're looking at it, make sure that you're talking about purely in terms of the author's experience or in terms of the composer's experience. And then link that to other aspects of Indigenous culture and Indigenous communities. If there are common threads, then you will discuss those and discuss how they do relate the story of the Aboriginal experience or Aboriginal culture, but they are in themselves their own story and they don't represent everyone. Focus on discussing how an author's perspective is represented, rather than, as I said, trying to represent Aboriginal people as a whole, because it's the same as any other kind of text. I know it is a common trap, particularly if you don't know much about Indigenous culture, but it's one of the things that when you're doing any kind of text, or when you're really analysing any kind of text, is that you focus on really discussing that person's point of view rather than everyone else's. Okay, the perspectives and issues that are now facing a lot of Indigenous populations have been ones that have been informed by the history, and ones which are continuing to transpire as time goes by. The ancestry of Indigenous populations, as I mentioned previously, have been traditionally divided by tribes and nations, and their beliefs and value systems are quite separate in many cases. Although many Aboriginal people identify as being Aboriginal, and that is probably the most common thread among all Aboriginal people, is that they identify as such and that they believe that they have a connection in some way with Indigenous culture and Indigenous society. Modern values of Indigenous Australians have integrated very much into Australian culture and Australian society, as in it's part of the broader spectrum of what makes up Australian society. Not to say that Indigenous culture is separated from Australian culture, it's just to say that many of the traditional values of Indigenous Australians have been integrated into Australian culture or have been lost. Issues such as health and welfare has become part of the Australian consciousness and the Australian or part of Australian society, as in they are issues which affect Australia as a whole. And even though health and welfare issues do affect many people in Aboriginal communities, they affect people in the broader Australian community, and certainly the broader Australian community takes an interest in not just community, or in terms of health and welfare issues in their own backyard, but in other backyards as well. So definitely in terms of the Indigenous population, many Australians are quite sympathetic, and many Australians are quite willing to help those communities which still have issues with health and welfare. Aboriginal movements in the past 50 years have also pushed for a lot of change in Australian society, as well as broader Australian movements as well. The push for civil rights, for one thing, and the push for basically for Indigenous people to be given the right to vote, to be considered Australian citizens, which up until 1967 they weren't. To have land rights, to have native title, which was introduced and further push following the Marburg case in 1992, and also the push for the apology for the stolen generations, which has occurred, but obviously work still needs to continue and still ongoing between fostering positive relationships between Indigenous communities and the rest of Australian society, to not make Indigenous communities feel like strangers at times. So all these things together incorporate not only what values are informing Indigenous texts, and bear in mind that they are going to be different sets of values, but they are things which do affect not only all Australians, but those who identify as being from an Aboriginal or Indigenous background, and those who do live in Aboriginal and identify themselves as being part of a culture or as part of a community. Okay. Now, stolen generations are part of majority of the English texts, and majority of the HSC English texts, which do feature Aboriginal themes, also do talk about the stolen generations as well. And it is a very sensitive topic. It does deal with very confronting themes and some very harrowing stories from people who were removed from their families at a young age, some of whom have never met their mum and dad. And it is a very sad story in a lot of cases, but basically it's one of those ones that you need to encounter with a bit of sympathy and a bit of empathy for not only the experiences and the perspectives that Indigenous people have, particularly those who were taken from their families, and even their extended families as well, those who are children and grandchildren of those who were taken away and were sent to live in church missions and in orphanages. And how that's affected what the Aboriginal identity is today. And it's a conflicted one. It's one which many who are still alive today can recount experiences of being taken away from their home, feeling like they had to be changed into something else entirely. And these sorts of stories you will encounter very heartbreaking and very sad themes, and it is important that you deal with them in a very sensitive way and that you are respectful. And there are means as well which you can discuss voice and perspective. Okay, so when you're discussing these stories, think of the voice and perspective of those who are speaking, and that how their experience have affected their outlook on life. It's one of those ways that you can discuss that experience, is how it's informed their voice and perspective. And as I said, take a sensitive view of that. Think about how it has affected them, how they say it has affected them, and discuss as well how that informs their perspective as individuals, and as they are authors and composers, those who have told their experience in an autobiographical sense, how it's informed their language and the way that they describe things as well. These stories also generally reflect certain types of themes as well, such as belonging, such as loss, community, identity, and family as well. So if you're looking for themes that you can talk about, you can obviously talk about these themes to start with. And also they can embody ideas such as change and journeys as well, particularly for a lot of communities as they sort of journey towards not only reconciliation, but journey to essentially find their identity again, and to and that idea of change and the aspect of change when they were removed, and what occurred in their life that caused such a huge and devastating impact. Okay, so when you're looking at it, don't just discuss it in terms of what happened, but how it can be viewed, how it does inform the text as well, and how those perspectives and those very strong and powerful messages do connect with a reader. And that's the one thing that a lot of these stories do really do. And as an Australian, you do read them and do really get connected with them, which is this idea that many of the stories do relate things that other people can relate to. They relate to our own families, they relate to our own stories. And when you are discussing these stories, you are considering how other people's families may be affected by similar sorts of stories, or how the stolen generations does affect all of us as Australians, and how we can basically feel for, first of all, to understand, to be empathetic for those who were removed from their families, and also to understand just the very experiences of those who were taken. Okay, we'll move on to Aboriginal English and language. Now, Aboriginal English, or Australian Aboriginal English, is a recognised dialect. It is still used quite often among a lot of Indigenous communities. Okay, and it is just a way of speaking. It's a way that a lot of Aboriginal and Indigenous people basically maintain and foster a connection with their own community, is by speaking in a language where they can use their own words, their own tone of voice, and their own ideas, their own language. Language represents the collective voices, beliefs, and societies of Aboriginal people. So it's one of the areas that Aboriginal people can be linked in some way, is through language. Although with Aboriginal English, it is one that varies from place to place, and some speak it in terms of more to do with their native language, so they'll incorporate more words from their native language, or more a tone that sort of reflects more of their native tongue, whereas others do sort of sound a lot more like Australian English, with a few of their own community terms sort of thrown in there as well. So it really depends on the society, but then again, it does reflect the uniqueness and individuality of each Aboriginal society, and indeed each individual Aboriginal community. The language follows many of the features of regular English, and it does vary, as I said, between communities. So it is English. It does follow the patterns and the rules and structure of English. The only difference is Creole, which is basically it's a separate language which incorporates English and Aboriginal words. So it follows the basic structure of English, and follows a lot of the language structures, but it has its complete own set of words and meanings, and also has its own set of grammar and syntax as well. And it's still spoken in Australia. I think the statistic is about 30,000 people in Aboriginal communities still speak Creole. So it is something that's still spoken. However, it's not the same as Aboriginal English. Okay, Aboriginal English is English as an English dialect. It is still very recognisable as English, whereas Creole is very much a language which is one possessed by the Indigenous community, and is one that can be spoken throughout Australia as well. Okay, so responding to themes and ideas in Aboriginal texts, you should basically answer or ask the following types of questions, and they're virtually the same questions you'd be asking for any other text with any other cultural perspective. First of all, what is the main idea of the text? As in, what is this text trying to communicate about Aboriginal identity, Aboriginal culture, or Aboriginal values? How does it represent those values and beliefs? How does it show them? How are the characters portrayed? How does it utilise language? Does it utilise Aboriginal English? How does it represent its specific community? These questions are virtually the same as you would give to any other text about any other culture or any other community. However, you need to think about in terms of a specific Indigenous community, and use the background that you've looked at in this video to inform your understanding about particularly Aboriginal community, Aboriginal language, Aboriginal people, and whether the story is fiction or non-fiction, Aboriginal values and beliefs and the main ideas, or essentially the motivations for an Indigenous author to write about a particular story. Okay, some tips when you are writing about an Aboriginal text. First of all, the most respectful term you can use is either an Aboriginal person or an Indigenous person or an Aboriginal Australian. A term like Aborigine, for instance, is in many cases offensive to people of an Aboriginal background, because it is a term that was given by essentially white settlers. The best term to use is an Indigenous person. It's one that represents people who were the first ones to live in Australia and are the native people of Australia, hence Indigenous person. So it's the most respectful word you can use, although Aboriginal person or Aboriginal people is still acceptable. Be sensitive, as I mentioned before. Many issues faced by Aboriginal people are confronting and deeply personal. And as with any culture, you need to be very sensitive of those. Avoid stereotypes. Okay, one thing we haven't mentioned is the stereotype of Aboriginal people. And they don't identify with how they're portrayed across the world. So if you think of how Aboriginal people are portrayed across the world, often it is how they dress and dance and how they have body paint and how they perform in front of touristy crowds. Whereas that's not how a lot of Aboriginal people represent themselves. In fact, I think virtually no one would represent themselves in that way. So think about them in terms of the people that they are and not that stereotype that sort of gets thrown around the place. A lot of Aboriginal people, as I said, live as part of mainstream Australian society. Very few Aboriginal people live in their own communities. And many Aboriginal people as well don't know much about their culture and their heritage and identify with being Aboriginal, but definitely don't identify with that stereotype. And finally, remember, communities are distinct and not all values are the same. So don't say that all Aboriginal people are this way or that way, because it's not the case, and it's just the same case for any other community or culture. Alright, so in conclusion, your focus is on Aboriginal perspective. So think about the sorts of experiences, the values, beliefs, and the communities of those who come from an Indigenous background. You need to discuss how they reflect the language and the people. And if you get any question, no matter if it's about themes, about language, about representation, about main ideas, about symbols, all of them reflect the language and the people and those who identify as being Aboriginal. And finally, develop appreciation of Indigenous Australian Aboriginal culture. Okay, develop that appreciation, because it's one of those things that's really going to, first of all, help you to talk about it. If you don't identify as being Indigenous, obviously, but appreciate it as many Australian people do. That it's very much a part of what makes Australia what it is. It's one of the rich cultures of Australia that really represent a lot of its history, and it does represent a lot of how Australians identify themselves. And use it, as I said, if you don't know much about Indigenous people or Indigenous Australian people, then use it as the opportunity to learn a bit more and to hopefully help you gain some sensitivities to their perspectives and their way of life, as well as other people as well. Otherwise, that's it for Australian or Aboriginal Australian culture. So until next time, see you later.